Hello and welcome to Journalists Hangout UK, the show where we discuss issues both African and worldwide which are affecting the continent. And we look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm Tamsan Majo and I'm pleased to welcome our panel. Priscilla Mwipo, Public Affairs Analyst, Lanre Akinola, Editor of African Business, Vuiswa Ngobongwana, Broadcaster. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Of course, I always give you a cup of tea after we finish hanging out. But Priscilla, this week, really, we want to talk about what is happening in the Italian elections. Absolutely. And this idea that some of these parties whose views are seen as right-wing are gaining in popularity, and of course having some of the people of African descent being part of it.
I think it's very interesting what's happening across the continent and what we saw in Italy. For me, I saw so many different things. I saw the Berlusconi coming back. I saw the young Luigi wanting to become president, and of course, you know, gathering the votes. And then there was the Nigerian who won an election, and coming from a populism party where, you know, he's very forthright about the fact that immigrants should not come. We should shut the doors on immigrants coming into Italy. The irony of that is that he's an immigrant himself, albeit he had been in Italy for 40 years, makes no difference cannot change his background, nor does it change his race. Okay,
Vuiswa, you've lived in the diaspora for a very long time.
Absolutely.
Would you see yourself joining a right-wing party, stopping other Africans from joining it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, in a way, a part of me feels some empathy for the desire that has driven Mr. Iwobi to be in the position that he's in. He's completely blind to the realities. And I think Frantz Fanon, an Algerian writer, put it very clearly when he called it cognitive dissonance. A disconnect between the reality around you and your desire. And somehow he hasn't managed to look at the reality around him. And if he has, he's decided to compromise it. He has sold his soul for a place in Italian society, as far as I can see. But I can empathize with the strong desire he has to fit in and thrive and live well, even though I totally disagree.
Yeah, Landry, you travel a lot. I mean, you and I spoke about how these issues of immigration affected Germany and Angela Merkel and the result last September. And but there are people speaking out, like footballers in Italy who disagree with Mr. Iwobi.
We're talking about Mario Balotelli.
Not
just any
yes.
footballer. Mario Balotelli.
The footballer.
He's a son of Ghanaian immigrants.
Well, you know, Europopulism is alive and well. In many countries, it's already in government. So what's happening in Italy is not, it's not out of the norm. It's not inconsistent with what's going on across the continent. As for the migration issue and Tony Iwobi, you know, once again, we see the exceptional ingenuity of Nigerians at play. So on one level, well done. On another level, what the hell? You know, it's a strange situation.
Yeah, Priscilla, this problem affects our generation as people in the diaspora, and probably some of the people who might be watching in Africa and thinking they want to come abroad, and thinking, what will be the attitude of fellow Africans who are already settled? I mean, I remember you and I arguing about the referendum of Brexit, and you were telling some very interesting stories about the attitudes that you came across.
Absolutely. I mean, I campaigned during the referendum that we should, the UK should remain in the EU. And it was very interesting that the Leavers were strongly campaigning, you know, immigration was something that they stood on very strongly. But the Remainers were saying, no, we're not going to touch on immigration. And it was so interesting to note that in a place like Dawson Market, whilst we were out canvassing, that this is a very multicultural, you know, community. And everybody asked the question literally about immigration. Yeah. and the Remainers were not prepared for it. And it was also interesting to meet other people of my same Nigerian origin who believed, and but their theory was that, no, we should vote out, because then if we vote out, then the UK will be forced to look at the Commonwealth. And I was, and I was like, when we speak of Commonwealth, it's not the African Commonwealth. We're speaking of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, that kind of Commonwealth. It's not the same. We're not treated the same. And I think that, as you said, there's a real cognitive dissonance amongst people. It's almost as though we are trying to deny history, or we're trying to deny our reality. Yeah. And we must not also forget that I feel that what we're seeing today is as a result of years of negative narrative against a particular race or against different races. And ultimately it's boiling up. So if you're coming from Nigeria or any other part of Africa and you're coming to Europe, be prepared to know that some of your brothers and sisters may not see things the way that you're seeing it.
I quite like that new catchphrase. I will use it next
Which
time.
is?
Denying history. And of course, if we look back at this concept of denying history and maybe people pretending to be what they are not when they are in the diaspora and closing gaps in terms of not allowing others to come in. I mean, how do you see what Iwobi has done in the concept of, will the people in Italy who are right-wing use him to cover up for any
Oh, absolutely. They're rubbing their hands in great celebration, cursing him behind his back, and really for the PR, just patting his back and really clapping hands. It's the classic dynamic that we face as African people right through history, not just African people, of course. You've heard it through slavery in the Americas, the house nigger. Mr. Iwobi is the house nigger. And he's quite happy. I can happily use that term in this context. I hope no one is offended, but look at the context. Don't fear the word, the context. Which brings me to why Mr. Iwobi feels it's okay to do this, because he genuinely thinks he can make a difference that way. You can't get through to him. I really don't think you can. But it's interesting for us, particularly the younger generation, who might look at him and think, wow, what is he doing? It's created a very sharp, viral discussion on the issue of identity. And as Africans, I think it's important that we understand that our historical roots are carried with us wherever we go on the planet.
Let me go to Landry. We talk about people in the diaspora being ambassadors of their own countries. Iwobi obviously will claim also that he is an ambassador of what Nigerians should be in the diaspora. But if you go back to her point, is his election, his attitude, his association, freedom of association with La Ligue actually giving respectability to racism?
Yeah, look, it will. I'm sure that that's part of the agenda, is to legitimize, these parties, and that's a tried and tested method. I mean, radical, right-wing, bigoted parties all over the world do that. For me, what's interesting is that this case in Italy shows that populism is not necessarily about racism. Populism is ultimately about being selfish, about being narrow-minded, being, having short-term perspectives, and that's an interesting dynamic here. I wouldn't just boil it down to race. It is very much about identity, and we saw it in this country as well. A lot of immigrants voted for Brexit, and Brexit was essentially an anti-immigrant vote. Yeah. For me, it's regressive, it's not good, it's not desirable, but hey, this is the world we live in.
But also, we have a wonderful example of an African in South Africa called Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who many people don't know much about, but is now finally coming into the history books.
Everyone knows about him.
Not everybody. He was deliberately hidden because of his radical stance. And I want to bring in something he said, which can lay a bridge, a foundation for kind of helping to break the divide that exists, the cognitive dissonance. He said he defined an African not by the color of your skin, but whether you love Africa. So if you love Africa, you are an African. Now that's quite a challenging idea within a South African context, perhaps even more so outside of South Africa. But it is the way forward for South Africans to start removing this colorism issue and talk about our identity based on what you are doing for your country?
Yeah, Priscilla, just a quick one, because I want to go and check
okay,
if the tea
very
is
quickly.
ready.
I do wonder, though, if he had been a member of any other party, would he have been elected?
Okay. On that note, we'll just take a quick break. I want to check if the tea is ready for my guest, but we've got plenty more to discuss, so please don't go away. Join us after a few moments. Hello and welcome back to Journalists Hangout UK. I'm Tamsang Ngajo, and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Priscilla Mwipo, Landre Akinola, and Vuyiswa Ngobongwana. Well, Priscilla, this is an important week, Mother's Day, but also, and probably globally, you talk about the International Day for Women. Going back to 1975, we know the United Nations was embracing the idea of making sure that women have their place in society. But I want to start off, because you've just had a nice cup of tea, I want to start off by going back and say to you, at what point did women lose their rights for them then to want to campaign to get back those rights?
Wow, what a question. At one point, should we go back 100 years? Because
Try
as
a few thousand, I think.
Try millennia.
because you know, it is also significantly, this year marks the 100th year that women began to fight for their rights, began to demand it. I think for we women, you know, and let me say happy International Women's Day to all women out there. I wish the celebration that we have every year would go with the treatment that women receive, be that in the boardroom or be that in the home or be that just in our walks of life, our respective walks of life. You would have thought that, you know, since the United Nations made it, you know, imperative that every year we must remember the woman. And not only that, but you find that in every government there's a ministry for women, you know, right across the globe. And yet the plight of the woman is one that we are still fighting for 100 years later. It's one that women are still saying, hey, you know, we should be more included in policies. We should be more included politically. We should be more included in our general walks of life. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, so the issue, Vuyiswa, if I come back to you, we were talking probably a year ago about some of the women activists and parliamentarians who were even saying for 3 or so days a month, women should be allowed to be paid and stay at home if they so choose. I mean, just signifying the importance of Africa and the role of women. You were in Zambia during the years of fighting. And how would you see the empowerment of women from the view of women in Southern Africa?
Well, not just Southern Africa. I mean, I'll start in Africa. I embrace the whole African continent because I'm a Pan-Africanist at heart, in deed and word. And I think for African women, we understand oppression very, very strongly because we are at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. Like all women, but particularly the darker toned women around the world are literally at the bottom of the totem pole, holding up the world. Any changes in any oppressive group, like Africans, like women, will happen not as a kind gesture, but because it's just unbearable not to meet those needs anymore. And I think when you look at it over 100 years, we have come a long way. there's still a long way to go, because you don't change government policy until you start to change the consciousness of people who automatically take it for granted that it's okay to treat women as second-class citizens, including the women themselves who collude in their own oppression. So it's really a stage of, or a process of unlocking the minds of all people, but particularly women. And I'm glad there's Women's Day, because it helps us to focus, at least for one day out of 365, on where we're at to take measure.
Yeah, Landry, Priscilla earlier on was very diplomatic. She didn't want to blame men because women lost their rights when there were all these cultural norms, then all these legislations that came into various countries, and then the 1908 fight, you know what happened in Germany, the Soviet Union, 1917, and probably then the 1975. But there are many milestones that we can talk about. Where do you see this going, and what do you think men need to do to allow women to assert their place?
Okay, so first of all, can I blame men? Yeah, is that okay? Okay, I blame.
I think it might be okay.
I blame men. I blame myself as well. As a man, what can we do? How do we get there? You know, what we need to do is build fairer societies. A big step towards that is making sure that this gender imbalance is fixed, is sorted out. But for me, ultimately, what I hope it leads to is just fairer societies for all, because it's not just women who are oppressed. Many men are oppressed. What is sometimes lost in this discussion is economic inequality, which affects everybody, whether you are male or female. And ultimately, for me, I hope it helps to build solidarity, not just in terms of gender, but in terms of class, and as people as a whole. So for me, it's great. I'd like to see more Women's Days. I've got absolutely no issues with that. I think one a year is a little bit. It's a little bit low. Yeah.
Priscilla, there's this issue about awareness. I know I've looked at your work, whether that was by choice or by necessity, but you are already doing a lot of work raising that awareness. And if there are young girls probably growing up in Nigeria knowing that they are going to struggle the most, how would we frame the challenges before them and what needs to be done?
I think in terms of what needs to be done, it's like, my sister said, it's about our psyche. It's about understanding the impact of our actions on another person. We tend to just take it for granted, I think, within our society, that we've been doing these things for so long, so it's normal and it's okay. But in actual fact, it isn't. When we are bringing up our young girls, we need to also teach them that they are just as valid as the young men. I know that within our African society, there is this unfortunate cultural preference for boys. I know that is something that had, ran right through for many years. I know it's beginning to change now, because, you begin to hear African parents now say, well, if I didn't have a girl, I don't know what I would have done, because they have come to realize the girls are more useful to them, taking care of them, remembers them a lot more. The boys tend to marry and they move away, whereas the women, though they marry, they still, come back to their parents. So I think it's about how we bring up our young girls and boys as well, because we can't do this without both of us being involved. The men and the women need to be involved.
Hold on to that point. I will come back, but before that, Viso, I want to go back to something that a few men have spoken about this year in particular, and saying, there are things that men need to do, but there are also things that women themselves need to do within the context of the cultural values, and FGM comes to mind, which is something that happens in so many countries around the world, and in Africa in particular. But men are not part of it. And yet that the fight to eliminate FGM is still something that is...
But men are part of it. FGM is female genital mutilation. Men are part of it in certain parts, because the women are helping them to see, to open up their eyes. These guys aren't deliberately blind. They've just been socialized in a way that's negative. So they're opening up their eyes to see the harm they're doing to their own daughters. And once these men understand, again, like Priscilla said, once you unlock the mind, then they see the value to the community to stop these practices, which are rooted in very old ideas which may have had some relevance 6, 7, 8, 10,000 years ago, but are no longer irrelevant. We are not a feudal society with those values anymore. But it takes time. It's a progression. So I'm glad that, I mean, if you take, for example, in Ethiopia, there are men who are actively campaigning against FGM. And also there is a women's group called Yanga. The Africa Spice Girls, they've been called. But what I like about them is they're not chasing the fame game only for themselves. They've defined themselves as representing all Ethiopian people, particularly Ethiopian children, which brings us right to the heart of Women's Day. Because when you educate the women, like Kwame Nkrumah said, you've got the whole nation.
Landry, you spoke about these days. Do you think this year there's been more awareness, but this is going to be very quickly, and do you see this as momentum going forward that will help people understand?
There's more awareness. You know, modern communication makes it easier to raise awareness. There's certainly more awareness. That can only be a good thing. So fingers crossed that it has a meaningful impact in the long term.
Okay, yeah, I think all these other movements that are going on, your work and everything else, the Bill Gates Foundation also putting money into the women's issues, and I think you continue to campaign and be that.
And our
that
growing
voice.
communication is the big difference.
Okay. Yeah, Priscilla, all those young women looking forward, how can they get help in terms of empowerment?
Well, in terms of empowerment, how can they get help? They should get help from fellow women and men too within our society. And I think more than anything, understanding is what eliminates a lot of the problems that we have. So it's also getting understanding.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for that. So that's about it that we have for you this week. Don't forget to follow us on Real JH UK on Facebook, on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Tamsa Ngajo from the entire team here in London. Goodbye and thank you for watching Journalists Hangout UK.